He was born in poverty. He rose through terror. He ruled through fear. And for 13 days, he held the fate of the planet in his hands. Nikita Khrushchev, a miner's son who climbed to the top of a nuclear superpower, a man who helped build Stalin's killing machine, then tried to dismantle it, a leader who promised peace and nearly started World War III. He sent millions into camps. He exposed Stalin's crimes. He slammed his fist at the United Nations. He placed nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida. And he smiled while the world prepared to die. Was he a reformer? A butcher? Or a reckless gambler who almost destroyed civilization? Tonight, we uncover the real story of Nikita Khrushchev. The purges, the lies, the wars, the secret deals, and the moment humanity came closer to extinction than ever before. The miner's son and farmhand. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev came into this world in 1894 in the small village of Kalinovka in the Kursk province. The village lived a hard peasant life. The land was poor. The harvests were meager. In winter, they starved. In summer, they worked until exhaustion. His father, Sergei Nikanorovich, labored in the mines of the Donbass. Work underground was considered the hardest and most dangerous. Men went into the pit before dawn and returned only at night. Coal fed the factories, but the miners' families remained in poverty. His mother, Ksenia Ivanovna, kept the house. The entire household was in her hands: a small vegetable garden, chickens, rare goats. This was not enough to feed the children. Every winter turned into an ordeal. From a young age, Nikita herded livestock. He worked in the fields. He hauled water. When he grew older, he went to work as a hired hand for the wealthy landowners, the kulaks. For a day's work, a bowl of stew and a chunk of bread. Sometimes hand-me-downs from the master's trunk. The Khrushchev family hut was cramped. The floor was clay. The ceiling was low. The stove provided heat and replaced a bed. At night, the children slept right on the floor. Old sheepskin coats replaced blankets. The beginning of the 20th century was a time of change. Rumors of revolutionaries reached the village. Donbass miners brought news of strikes and workers' meetings. Peasants discussed bread prices, taxes, and government seizures. Kalinovka lived in anticipation of a storm. Khrushchev absorbed this harsh existence from childhood. Not books, but hard labor formed his character. Not teachers, but mining crews taught him about life. Every step was a reminder of the price of survival. Thus began the road of a man destined to rise from a hired hand's lot to the pinnacle of power in a vast country. The mining years and education. In 1908, the Khrushchev family left Kalinovka and moved to the Donbass. His father got a job as a miner in Yuzovka. The family's life changed. Around them stood mine towers, workers' barracks, and endless slag heaps. 14-year-old Nikita went to work as a fitter's apprentice. He repaired mine carts. He cleaned parts. The earnings were miserable, but they allowed them to buy bread. In 1911, he descended into the pit for the first time. Shifts lasted 12 hours. The mine was filled with coal fumes. People coughed up blood. Accidents happened every week. In 1912, a school opened at the mine. Khrushchev went there along with other teenagers. He studied for 2 years: literacy, arithmetic, basic geometry. This turned out to be enough to read newspapers and count earnings. In 1915, his father was drafted into the army. The family was left without a provider. Nikita became the main breadwinner. Now he worked not only in the pit, but also on odd jobs. After the revolution of 1917, the mines became a place of fierce debates. Workers' councils were created. Meetings were held. In 1919, Khrushchev was elected a member of the Factory Committee. This became his first serious step toward power. In the early 1920s, he studied at a vocational school. It provided the basics of technology. Here, Khrushchev received systematic knowledge. Not brilliance, but persistence. Not talent, but energy. By 1924, he was already considered an active party figure in the Donbass. He held meetings. He monitored the fulfillment of plans. He conducted propaganda. By this moment, his name had become noticeable in the mining community. Stalin's apprentice. In 1925, Khrushchev became the secretary of the party cell at the Rudchenkovo mine. In 1926, he was transferred as an instructor to the district committee. There, he kept records, checked reports, led propaganda, and prepared summaries for regional authorities. By the end of the decade, his name was already heard at meetings across the Donbass. In 1929, he was sent to Moscow. The appointment was accompanied by enrollment in the Industrial Academy. The academy was overseen by Lazar Kaganovich. He was lifting energetic upstarts from the working class to the top. Through Kaganovich, Khrushchev's name came to the attention of Stalin. Study was combined with party practice. During the day, lectures on technology and economics. In the evening, party meetings, reports, debates. Every week, character assessments of activists were compiled. Khrushchev's assessment emphasized diligence and ruthlessness. In 1932, he was appointed secretary of the Bauman District Committee. The Bauman district was industrial and tense. Factories were missing targets. Shop bosses argued with planning departments. Failure to meet quotas was turned into a political crime. Khrushchev conducted surprise inspections. Commissions arrived at factories at night. They checked shift schedules, quotas, and records of defects. Lists of the guilty went to the city committee. The city committee passed materials to the security services. In 1933, he was pulled up to the Moscow City Committee. There he dealt with personnel and discipline. Meetings dragged on until night. Stacks of denunciations lay on the table. Every denunciation required a reaction. The reaction became an inspection, a reprimand, dismissal, or arrest. Moscow was entering a period of total purges. First, a party purge. They checked origins, behavior, statements. People were ousted by the thousands. Some lost their party cards for drunkenness and absenteeism. Others were declared two-faced and enemies. In 1935, Khrushchev became the first secretary of the Moscow City Committee. He held the entire city party machine in his hands. Appointments of directors were approved through the committee bureau. Staff re-evaluation was continuous. Every week, dozens of orders were signed. Industrial discipline became a political theme. At the ZIS automotive plant, the truck plan failed. Defective products piled up at aviation plants. City committee commissions recorded sabotage. Materials went to the NKVD. Arrests became routine. In 1936, Moscow hosted the show trials. The Hall of Columns became a stage for confessions. The city committee provided the crowd, lists of factory delegates, and discipline in the hall. In newsreels, these sessions were presented as the triumph of justice. At the factories, this was read as a signal for new purges. In 1937, Khrushchev also took charge of the Moscow Regional Committee. The Great Terror began. In July, NKVD Order number 00447 was issued. The order launched mass operations against socially dangerous elements. Quotas were sent down to every region. Category 1 meant execution. Category 2 meant the Gulag. A troika was created in the Moscow region. The Troika consisted of the first secretary, the head of the regional NKVD, and the prosecutor. The Troika reviewed cases in an accelerated manner. Protocols were signed in batches. Dozens of protocols went through in a day. Lists of names took up pages. The system worked like a conveyor belt. District committees formed summaries by enterprises. The regional committee compiled figures and names into general lists. The NKVD processed cases and prepared protocols. The Troika approved them. The sentence was carried out at night. The geography of executions had specific addresses. The Butovo firing range became a site of secret mass graves. Kommunarka received special lists. The Donskoy crematorium hid the traces after closed executions in prisons. Relatives were given certificates stating 10 years without the right of correspondence. Closed meetings were held at the city committee. District secretaries reported on the fulfillment of quotas. Additional quotas were requested. New enemy nests were being uncovered. The wording was repeated from protocol to protocol. The meaning remained the same. Accelerate. Factory party committees competed in vigilance. At ZIS, foremen were removed for defects and hidden sabotage. At electrotechnical factories, they looked for rightist deviants. At aviation plants, engineers were persecuted for modernization delays. Every week, reports brought new names. Party life turned into a series of self-exposures. People repented at meetings, renounced their friends, demanded punishment for former colleagues. In the city committee bureau, this was called cleansing the ranks. Khrushchev kept the rhythm of the campaign. He spoke at plenums and meetings. His tone was harsh and direct. He demanded exposure, acceleration, no mercy. His speeches were printed in transcripts for classified use. Excerpts were read aloud at factories. The mechanics of suppression penetrated everyday life. At night, the Black Marias, police vans, arrived. Lights went out in apartment blocks. Neighbors turned away so as not to be witnesses. In the morning, new orders about removals and expulsions hung at the factory gate. Personnel decisions went hand in hand with the security organs. The first secretary signed party measures. Security organs took criminal measures. 1 week, a person was stripped of their party card. The next week, they were charged with a crime. A month later, the person vanished. In 1938, reshuffles began in the NKVD leadership. The tempo of arrests changed, but the machine had already picked up speed. Many cases were reviewed formally. Many sentences remained in force. Lists were still approved in batches. Stalin controlled the capital personally. Meetings on the Moscow organization were held in the Kremlin. Khrushchev also reported at them. He explained figures, reports, failures, and successes. He was trusted as a man who gets things done. During 3 years of Moscow leadership, he passed the test of loyalty. The secretary of the Farmhand district became the master of the city and region. The task was simple and terrifying. Maintain the plan, maintain fear, maintain control. This school of power was decisive for Khrushchev. Moscow made him visible to Stalin. Moscow gave him the experience of ruling through pressure and purges. Moscow opened the next door. The door to Ukraine. The door to a new wave of repressions and a new career. Bloody Kyiv. In January 1938, Nikita Khrushchev was appointed first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine. The decision was made in the Kremlin. Stalin trusted him after the Moscow purges. Now it was necessary to strengthen leadership in Ukraine. Kyiv met him with anxiety. The city was paralyzed by arrests. The streets buzzed with rumors. At night, hundreds of people disappeared. Security organs worked without stopping. Ukraine was considered one of the main hotbeds of hostile elements. Here, the quotas of NKVD Order 00447 were strictly enforced. Thousands of engineers, professors, military men, and former officers ended up on the lists. Every month, telegrams were sent requesting new quotas. Khrushchev participated in the meetings of the Ukrainian Troika. The first secretary of the party, the People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, and the prosecutor signed the protocols. In one day, they could approve hundreds of names. One protocol meant dozens of death sentences. In the summer of 1938, Khrushchev reported to Moscow on unmasked enemies. He reported on the liquidation of nationalist organizations, on the fight against rightist and Trotskyist deviants. We are talking about thousands of people, many of whom had no connection to politics whatsoever. His letters to the Central Committee are preserved in the archives. He asked for permission to intensify repressions in a number of regions. Special attention was paid to the Donbass and Kharkiv. There, miners and engineers were arrested for sabotaging coal production plants. In September 1938, Kyiv prisons were overcrowded. Documents mention tens of thousands of prisoners. At night, trains were sent north to the Gulag camps. Some people were exterminated right in the suburbs of Kyiv. There were also high-profile trials. In November 1938, a show trial of Ukrainian nationalists was held in Kyiv. The hall was full of party activists. Newspapers printed transcripts. The result was predictable: death sentences. In 1939, Khrushchev spoke at a plenum of the Ukrainian Central Committee. He reported on identified enemies and on the achievements of socialist construction. The numbers sounded dry. Hundreds executed, thousands sent to camps. This was presented as the success of the party leadership. Parallel to this were economic tasks. It was necessary to restore the coal mines of the Donbass, to organize the work of factories in Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk, to fulfill the grain procurement plan. Every failure was explained by sabotage. Every failure was accompanied by a new wave of arrests. In 1939, the Soviet Union annexed Western Ukraine. Khrushchev personally oversaw the organization of power in the new territories. Party commissions checked schools, administrations, and economic bodies. Thousands of people were declared unreliable. Some were sent to camps. Some were deported. In 1940, he continued to lead Ukraine. By this time, the count of repressed people was in the hundreds of thousands. Every report from Khrushchev to Moscow was a report on the successful fight against enemies. These reports strengthened his position. Ukraine turned into a testing ground for mass operations. It was here that Khrushchev was hardened as a party leader. Here he became a figure of national scale. Here his name was firmly established in the circle of Stalin's closest disciples. The Shadows of Stalingrad. In late June 1941, Nikita Khrushchev was appointed a member of the Military Council of the Southwestern Front. The front headquarters was located near Kyiv. The commander was Mikhail Kirponos. Representatives from headquarters changed frequently. The situation was collapsing daily. The tasks of a military council member were formulated extremely harshly. Organizing defense, political work in the units, discipline and tribunals, evacuation of enterprises, accounting for human reserves. End of June, beginning of July. Orders from headquarters demanded holding Kyiv. Front command asked for permission to retreat. Telegrams went one after another. There was no permission. The city was fortified in haste. Evacuation of factories and archives was underway. Trains were loaded at night. Columns moved east. Schedules fell apart. A shortage of train cars. Tens of thousands of people ended up on the roads. September 1941 became a catastrophe near Kyiv. The front's group was encircled. Mikhail Kirponos died while breaking out of the ring. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and commanders were taken prisoner. Kyiv was abandoned. The southwestern front effectively lost its combat capability. After the Kyiv pocket, an investigation into the causes followed. Headquarters asked about overdue reports, about losses of equipment, about the lack of coordination between armies. Military and political conclusions were made hastily. Personnel decisions followed, one after another. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was spent restructuring the command. Khrushchev worked on the military council of the new southwestern direction. The main theme was restoring units, replenishing divisions, restoring discipline, eliminating desertion and looting. The spring of 1942 brought the Kharkiv gamble. The offensive began in May. The goal was stated as brief: capture Kharkiv and straighten the front. Reality turned into a new encirclement. The Barvenkovo salient was destroyed. The losses were huge. The summer of 1942 moved Khrushchev to the south. Headquarters sent him as a member of the military council of the Stalingrad front. Commander Andrei Eremenko. Street fighting was already raging in the city. The banks of the Volga were under fire day and night. Tasks were fixed in encrypted messages, supporting the defense of the right bank, deploying blocking detachments, organizing crossings, evacuation of the civilian population, political support for the units of the Stalingrad Group. Communication with the 62nd Army was maintained across the Volga. Commissars and lecturers worked in the city. Summaries were read right in the basements. Orders on discipline were harsh. Cowards and looters faced the tribunal. Autumn 1942 led to the counterstrike. Operation Uranus started in November. Strikes were launched against the enemy's flanks. The ring closed near Kalak. The German 6th Army of Field Marshal Paulus lost contact with the outside world. December brought Little Saturn. The enemy lost its foothold on the Don. Headquarters conveyed tasks to the fronts through daily directives. Military councils coordinated supply and replenishment. Political departments recorded a rise in morale. January 1943 announced Operation Ring. The destruction of the encircled group proceeded day by day. Front headquarters worked to the limit. Award lists were compiled in parallel with casualty reports. The city lay in ruins. The Volga became a road of life, not death, once again. In the spring of 1943, Khrushchev was transferred to the Voronezh front. Commander Nikolai Vatutin. Preparation for defense at the Kursk Bulge began long before the first shot. Deeply echeloned lines were built. Fortified areas were saturated with anti-tank weapons. Minefields covered kilometers. Political work was restructured for the new reality. Lecture halls were replaced by short briefings in the trenches. Captured leaflets were studied. Responses to psychological attacks by the enemy were practiced. Disinformation was cut off by orders. Rumors were suppressed on the spot. July 1943 brought Kursk. The first blow was held by Army Corps on the southern face. Reserves were introduced in doses. Headquarters demanded conserving strength for the counterstrike. Armies moved forward. The enemy retreated. Autumn brought renaming. The Voronezh front became the first Ukrainian front. The task: the liberation of Kyiv and the right bank. Preparation proceeded at an accelerated pace. Crossings over the Dnieper were created at night. Supplies were brought up over pontoon bridges. November 1943 concluded the Kyiv operation. The assault developed from several bridgeheads. The city was liberated on November 6th. Reports indicated enormous destruction. districts without electricity, water mains smashed. Immediately after Kyiv, the struggle to hold the lines began. The enemy launched counterattacks near Zhytomyr and Fastiv. Positions changed hands several times a day. Evacuation and mobilization teams worked continuously. Front headquarters demanded reinforcements. Ammunition stocks were melting away. The winter of 1943 to 1944 passed under the sign of the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky operation. The ring closed around a large enemy group. The battles were severe and bloody. Weather hindered aviation. Columns got stuck in the mud. The enemy's breakout from the pocket cost both sides huge losses. In the spring of 1944, operations took place in right bank Ukraine. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Ukrainian fronts coordinated strikes. Military councils synchronized supply and repair. Partisan units joined in destroying communications. Headquarters demanded acceleration of the tempo. The enemy's lines of retreat collapsed. In the summer of 1944, the Lvov-Sandomier's operation began. A road to the Vistula was punched through. The Sandomier's bridgehead was created. Front staffs built crossings to the point of exhaustion. Sanitary battalions stretched for tens of kilometers. Intermediate ammunition depots opened right by the roads. The daily routine of a military council member did not look glamorous. It was endless reports. Distribution of reinforcements among divisions. Selection of commanders after losses. Signatures on orders for awards and penalties. Reviewing disciplinary cases. Khrushchev's role in the war is recorded in staff documents and meeting transcripts. It was political responsibility for steadfastness and order. It was control over the rear and river crossings. It was participation in coordinating operations at the level of fronts and headquarters. It was public speeches before units on the eve of assaults. It was personal trips to the front line on critical days. The spring of 1945 closed the Ukrainian chapter of his military work. The fronts moved further west. Ukraine was largely liberated and returned to Soviet administration. Kyiv was restoring power and the economy. Party bodies returned to a peacetime structure. Military councils transferred powers to civilians. May 1945 marked the end of the war. Reports no longer required new reserves daily. Command posts were packed up. Front staffs prepared reports. Political departments summarized results. Nikita Khrushchev finished the war as a figure of national scale. The experience of war became his main resource for the future. The harshness of decisions, the habit of mobilization discipline, the ability to take a punch of criticism, the ability to work under constant pressure, the readiness to sign the heaviest orders. This experience would lead him further, to post-war Ukraine, to the struggle for power in Moscow, to decisions that would make the whole world shudder. Post-war Ukraine. May 1945. The victory parade is held on Red Square. The war is over. But for Ukraine, it is just beginning in a new dimension. The republic is in ruins. More than 70% of industry is destroyed. Hundreds of villages are burned. Kyiv and Dnipropetrovsk lie in rubble. Millions of people have lost their homes and jobs. In these months, Nikita Khrushchev returns to Kyiv as the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine. The appointment was approved in the Kremlin. Stalin trusted Khrushchev after his years at the front and the Moscow purges. Now he was entrusted with the restoration of a key republic. The first task, Donbas coal. In 1945, the mines were producing barely half of the pre-war level. Pits were flooded. Equipment was taken away or destroyed. Khrushchev personally inspects the mines. He visits Kadivka, Stalino, Makivka. He demands accelerated commissioning of shafts from directors. Threats for missed deadlines are heard at meetings. Every car of coal is counted like military ammunition. The second direction: metal. Dnipropetrovsk factories lie in ruins. Stalin orders the restoration of the Dnieper hydroelectric station at any cost. In 1947, they begin to raise the turbines. War veterans and women work on the construction site. They live in barracks. They eat on ration cards. Khrushchev reports to Moscow. The launch of the Dnipro-HES will be completed on time. Kyiv turns into a gigantic construction site. They are raising Kreshchatyk Street. They are building up Podil. Architects propose projects with wide avenues and Stalinist skyscrapers. Khrushchev personally approves the plans. He demands monumentality. He demands that the center of the capital look like a symbol of victory. But along with construction, there is a war in the rear. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, continues to operate in the western lands. They attack garrisons, kill district committee secretaries, blow up warehouses. In 1945 and 1946, NKVD bodies record thousands of attacks. Khrushchev demands decisive measures. Special troops are brought in. Mass operations begin in the forests of Volhynia, Galicia, and the Carpathians. Villages of suspects are burned. Families of OUN and UPA members are deported to Siberia. According to official reports, tens of thousands of people are sent in trains. In parallel, Khrushchev strengthens the party apparatus. He places proven frontline soldiers and his countrymen from the Donbas in key posts. Opponents are removed. Apparatus purges begin inside the Republican Central Committee. Any disagreement is interpreted as nationalist deviation or detachment from the party. By the end of the 40s, the composition of the leadership is completely renewed. People obligated personally to Khrushchev for their careers work locally. In 1947, a new blow arrives: famine. Drought and ruined farms lead to a catastrophe. Peasants die en masse in Vinnytsia, Kyiv, and Poltava regions. People boil grass, eat tree bark. Hundreds of cases of cannibalism are recorded in reports. Meanwhile, grain procurement goes according to plan. Millions of tons of grain are taken out of Ukraine. Moscow and Leningrad receive bread. Trains go abroad under agreements with Eastern Europe. Emptiness remains locally. Khrushchev's telegrams to the Central Committee are preserved in the archives. He reported on the fulfillment of the procurement plan, on the need to increase peasant discipline, on sabotage at the local level. Every complaint from below was treated as anti-Soviet agitation. Operational groups went into the villages. Peasants were given prison terms for theft of collective farm grain. According to rough estimates, during the famine of 1947 to 1948, several 100,000 people died in Ukraine. Newspapers are silent about this. The chronicle of hunger is replaced by the chronicle of recovery. Photographs of happy collective farmers are printed next to decrees of the Council of Ministers. At the same time, Khrushchev actively promotes social projects. New schools open in Kyiv. Theaters and libraries are built. The university is being restored in Kharkiv. Official propaganda shows a picture of flourishing. But beneath this shell lie hunger and fear. In 1949, mass operations against the underground take place in western Ukraine. Ministry of Internal Affairs units conduct sweeps of forests. Thousands of arrests. Hundreds executed without trial. Khrushchev reports on the liquidation of the nationalist underground. In fact, the struggle continues for many more years. By this time, he has become the undisputed master of Ukraine. His support in Moscow is strengthening. His experience with repressions, fighting the underground, and restoring the economy is valued. Stalin uses Khrushchev as a reliable manager. Khrushchev, in turn, strengthens his personal positions and prepares for the next leap. The post-war years made Ukraine his arena of power. The country lived on the edge between construction sites and prison camps, between parades and famine, between promises and fear. Khrushchev managed to maintain control over this chaos. And this is exactly what led him to the Kremlin. The death of Stalin, power struggle, and Crimea. March 5, 1953. The death of Stalin becomes a milestone of an era. A temporary balance rests on the agreements of Malenkov, Beria, and Molotov. Nikita Khrushchev holds the post of Secretary of the Central Committee. The decisive resource is personnel. April 1953. Khrushchev gains oversight of personnel policy. Appointments of ministers and regional committee secretaries begin to pass through his desk. He assembles a team of proven people. June 1953. Lavrenti Beria is arrested at a meeting of the Presidium. Marshal Zhukov and the military secure the operation. In the fall, a closed trial and execution will follow. The security apparatus passes under party control. September 1953. The plenum elects Khrushchev as the first secretary of the Central Committee. The party once again becomes the central organ of power. Malenkov formally heads the government. Real weight shifts to the party vertical. Winter 1953 to 1954. A review of some cases of the repressed begins. Prisoners under political articles are released. The country is given a signal of softening. Parallel to this, major administrative decisions are being prepared. February 19, 1954. The Presidium of the Supreme Soviet adopts a decree transferring the Crimean Oblast from the Russian SFSR to the Ukrainian SSR. The motivation is official. Economic expediency, shared economic ties, transport and energy connection to Ukraine. The decision is agreed upon at the level of the Central Committee. Khrushchev supports the transfer as part of the policy of strengthening Ukraine. Spring 1954. The plenum announces the course for the development of the Virgin Lands. The first trains leave for Kazakhstan. Resources are redistributed through party decisions. The first secretary turns into the architect of the campaign. 1955. Malenkov is removed from the post of chairman of the Council of Ministers. Bulganin takes his place. Khrushchev consolidates power through the apparatus and regional supports. The party shapes the agenda. The government executes. By summer, power is concentrated in the hands of the first secretary of the Central Committee. The system is rebuilt to his style. Rapid decisions, personnel reshuffles, ambitious plans. The country is preparing for a new course. The Secret Report. February 1956. Moscow is preparing for the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The hall of the Kremlin Palace of Congresses is filled with delegates from all over the country. Thousands of people representing millions. The Congress promises to be ordinary, but a sensation is brewing behind the scenes. Khrushchev has been first secretary for 2 years now. His power is strengthened. Beria is gone. Malenkov is pushed aside. Zhukov is an ally. Bulganin formally leads the government. But the real decision-making center is in the hands of the party. The agenda of the Congress is standard. Report on the 5-year plan. Plans for industrial development. Speech on new collective farm programs. But a special document is being prepared for a narrow circle. A report on the cult of personality of Stalin. Work on it went on in secret. Materials were collected by historians and Central Committee staff. They studied NKVD archives. They pulled up protocols on the purges of the 30s, lists of repressed Politburo members, transcripts of show trials. All this was laid on Khrushchev's desk. The night of February 24th to 25th, 1956. Closed session. No outsiders present. Only Congress delegates are present. Khrushchev steps to the podium. In his hands is a folder stamped "Top Secret." The speech lasts more than 4 hours. The tone is dry, harsh, accusatory. Khrushchev reads about mass repressions, about how executions were approved by lists, about how Stalin signed protocols with troikas, about how innocent people died by the hundreds of thousands. He talks about the failures of the war, about how Stalin ignored intelligence warnings in the summer of 1941, about the catastrophes of the first months, about how generals were held responsible for mistakes, arrested, and shot. He speaks of the cult of personality, about the monuments that grew everywhere, about renamed cities, about thousands of books and articles praising the genius of all times. Khrushchev declares, "This contradicts the spirit of the party. This is the leader's detachment from the masses." The report becomes a shock. Silence reigns in the hall. Some delegates lose consciousness. Some weep. Some are silent, disbelieving that all this is being spoken officially. The report ends with a call to return to Leninist norms. Khrushchev promises never again to allow a cult of personality. Promises that the party will lead collectively. The effect is instant. Within a few days, the report begins to be read at closed meetings of party organizations across the country. Every secretary is obliged to acquaint the activists with its content. For the first time in decades, people hear about the crimes of the Stalin era from the lips of the leadership. In the spring of 1956, the report leaks abroad. Western intelligence agencies get a copy. Newspapers print excerpts. The world learns that a revision of Stalinism is underway inside the Soviet Union. The reaction is ambiguous. Protest moods intensify in Poland and Hungary. In the fall of 1956, an uprising breaks out in Budapest. Soviet tanks enter Hungary. Blood on the streets. Thousands dead. The report on the cult of personality turns into a signal for rebellion. Inside the country, the reaction is also contradictory. Old party members are silent or express dissatisfaction. Stalinists whisper about betrayal. Youth and intellectuals meet the report with hope. The thaw begins. New books, films, plays appear. Censorship is relaxed. But along with hope comes fear. If Stalin was a criminal, then who signed the orders next to him? If the purges were a mistake, then why did Khrushchev himself participate in them in Moscow and Ukraine? These questions are not yet spoken aloud, but they hang in the air. Khrushchev took the main step. He destroyed the myth of Stalin's infallibility. He became a symbol of change. But with this, he opened Pandora's box, a box from which doubt, protests, and fears escaped. The Corn Saga and Economic Experiments. Spring 1954. Khrushchev speaks at a Central Committee plenum. He announces the Virgin Lands Development Program. Millions of hectares of Kazakh and Siberian steppes must be plowed in the shortest possible time. Hundreds of thousands of young people go to collective and state farms. Trains with volunteers leave from Moscow, Kyiv, Leningrad. The first years, the virgin lands yield record harvests. Newspapers print photos of wheat ears stretching beyond the horizon. Tractors plow the steppes. The romance of the new land captures the youth. Khrushchev personally inspects the fields, speaks to collective farmers. He is called the first agronomist of the country. But difficulties hide behind the loud slogans. The supply system lags behind. There is no housing for settlers in Kazakhstan. People live in tents and dugouts. In spring, the steppe turns into a swamp. In summer, into a dusty desert. Millions of hectares are raised, but millions of tons of grain perish from droughts and winds. Khrushchev believes in corn. After a trip to the USA in 1959, he returns with the idea of a corn revolution. American farms impress him with their yields. He orders the expansion of corn planting in all regions of the Soviet Union, from the Carpathians to the Urals, even where the climate contradicts it. Collective farms receive directives. Replace grain with corn. Regional committee secretaries report on successes. In reality, fields are overgrown with weeds. Cold summers kill the crops. Yields fall. Livestock are underfed. There is a shortage of fodder. In 1958, another reform of agricultural management begins. Sovnarkhozes, councils of national economy, are created. The goal is to bring management closer to production. Moscow transfers powers to the local level. But instead of efficiency, chaos arrives. Enterprises lose touch with the center. Ministries are paralyzed. Supply collapses. In 1960, Khrushchev goes further. He announces a program to catch up and overtake America in meat and milk production. Newspapers come out with slogans. In schools, they read poems about corn and rivers of milk. Collective farms drive cattle to slaughter in desperation just to meet the plan. A year later, herds shrink. There is a shortage of meat. Less milk than before. Khrushchev experiments in industry too. He abolishes union ministries. Instead, hundreds of sovnarkhozes are created. Each is responsible for a separate region. This tears apart the unified economic system. Plans stop matching up. Enterprises complain of deficits in parts and materials. But criticism is stifled. Reports on innovation go to the plenums. In 1962, the crisis reaches its peak. In Novocherkassk, workers at an electric locomotive plant take to the streets. The reason? Price hikes on meat and bread alongside low wages. The crowd goes to the city committee. Slogans sound, "Bread" and "Down with corn." Troops are brought into the city. Fire is opened without warning. Dozens of people die. Bodies are secretly buried in mass graves. Newspapers are silent. Despite the disasters, Khrushchev does not abandon the course. He continues to talk about new methods, about the need for economic boldness, that without corn, the country will not rise. But discontent grows among the population. They whisper about hunger in the villages. In cities, they laugh at corn slogans. Economic experiments destroy trust in power. Promises to catch up with America turn into jokes. Corn becomes a symbol of failure. Sovnarkhozes, a symbol of chaos. The Virgin Lands, a symbol of excess. By the beginning of the 60s, it becomes clear. The country is tired of continuous reforms. The economy is stalling, shelves are emptying, and faith in Khrushchev is melting away. America and shoes. In 1956, at a reception in Moscow, Khrushchev dropped a phrase that terrified the West. "We will bury you." Americans heard it as a threat of nuclear annihilation. Khrushchev later claimed he meant economic victory, that socialism would outlive capitalism. But the translation had already done its work. In the eyes of ordinary Americans, he became the face of Soviet menace. From that moment on, every move he made was watched through the lens of fear. In July 1959, before his American tour, Khrushchev entered into the famous kitchen debate with Vice President Richard Nixon. They stood inside a model American kitchen in Moscow. Color televisions, refrigerators, plastic countertops, and two men pointing fingers at each other. They argued about communism and capitalism, about living standards, about the future of the world. For the first time, the Cold War unfolded live on camera. 2 systems, 2 leaders, 1 kitchen. September 1959. Nikita Khrushchev's visit to the United States becomes a breakthrough. Washington meets the Soviet leader at the highest level. Red carpets and TV cameras turn politics into a spectacle. The route passes through New York, Washington, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, San Francisco. At factories, they show assembly lines and standardization. In Hollywood, the dream factory and the big screen. On farms, they show labor organization and technology. In Los Angeles, a visit to an amusement park is canceled. Security services give no guarantees. Public irritation pours out in a sharp retort about fear and rockets. Newspapers spread the quotes around the world. The image of a hot-tempered but direct leader is cemented. Camp David becomes a symbol of détente. Unofficial talks with Dwight Eisenhower proceed without protocol. The sides grope for a compromise. A reciprocal visit by the American president to Moscow is planned. Next spring will ruin it. May 1960. A U-2 spy plane is shot down over Soviet territory. The Paris summit collapses on the very first day. Negotiations turn into an exchange of accusations. Trust evaporates. September to October 1960. The UN General Assembly turns into an arena of scandals. Khrushchev pounds the table with his fist, interrupts speakers, demands the floor for delegations from African and Asian countries. The shoe myth appears in reporters' stories. Photos and testimonies diverge. There is no official confirmation. The image remains. The Russian with the shoe becomes an international caricature. June 1961. Vienna hosts a meeting between Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. The conversation is harsh and cold. Topics: Germany and Berlin. Each side leaves without concessions. Tension grows. August 1961. In Berlin, barbed wire barriers go up. Then they build the wall. The city is sliced in half. The West protests. The East strengthens the border. The crisis becomes a symbol of a divided world. By the end of the year, it becomes clear. Khrushchev's foreign policy is a mix of audacity and improvisation. Loud gestures bring both dividends and risks. Détente and scandal walk side by side. The world gets used to living on the edge. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Spring 1962. The Soviet Union decides to strengthen its position in the global race. Khrushchev insists, "America surrounds us with bases. We must respond symmetrically." The choice falls on Cuba. The island of socialism right off the U.S. coast becomes the ideal platform for placing missiles. The operation is named Anadir. The task: to secretly transfer intercontinental intermediate-range missiles to Cuba. Along with them, anti-aircraft systems, tanks, aviation, units of Soviet troops. In July and August 1962, the first ships leave Odessa and Sevastopol. Soldiers are dressed in civilian clothes. Ships are labeled agricultural machinery. In reality, nuclear weapons. September. American reconnaissance planes record unusual shipments. But there is no proof. Soviet diplomats assure aid to Cuba is purely defensive in nature. Khrushchev smiles at meetings with Western correspondents. He repeats, "We are only protecting a small country." October 14th, 1962. An American U-2 plane takes photos. The photos clearly show launch pads for Soviet missiles. Washington receives confirmation of its worst fears. John Kennedy convenes the National Security Council. Photos are shown to members of Congress. Secrecy disappears. On October 22nd, Kennedy speaks on television. he announces. A quarantine, a naval blockade, is being introduced around Cuba. The American fleet is ready to intercept Soviet ships. In case of a breakthrough, open military conflict will follow. The world freezes. Newspapers write about the beginning of nuclear week. Stocks of canned goods are swept from shelves. In U.S. schools, drills on taking cover from strikes are held. In the USSR, alerts are heightened at military airfields. Khrushchev sends letters to Kennedy. In the first, a peaceful tone. A compromise is proposed. The USSR will remove missiles from Cuba if the USA guarantees the island's inviolability. The next day comes a second letter. Harsh, ultimatum-like. A demand to remove American missiles from Turkey and Italy. Washington sees a contradiction. Some military men in the Kremlin advise pressing further. Others, to find a way out. Secret communication channels work around the clock. USSR Ambassador to Washington Dobrynin negotiates directly with the president's brother, Robert Kennedy. On October 27th, an American U-2 spy plane is shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, is killed. He becomes the only combat casualty of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis. In Washington, the Pentagon demands immediate retaliation. The world holds its breath. Kennedy hesitates. The Soviet Union readies strategic missiles. The world stands one step away from catastrophe. The same day, Khrushchev sends Kennedy an urgent message. The tone is conciliatory. He agrees to remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the USA promises not to attack the island. The issue of Turkish missiles is moved to the closed part of the negotiations. In March 1963, they are indeed removed, but officially this is not linked to Cuba. On October 28, 1962, Kennedy and Khrushchev announced détente. Soviet ships turn around. Construction of missile sites stops. Cuba is left without strategic weapons. In the Kremlin, this decision is met ambiguously. Some believe Khrushchev saved the world. Some that he surrendered. Fidel Castro is indignant. He wasn't even invited to the negotiating table. Cuba feels humiliated. In the Soviet Union, official propaganda presents everything as a victory for peace and common sense. But in the corridors of the Politburo, the mood is different. Doubts about Khrushchev's leadership intensify. For the first time, they openly say, his decisions are risky, and the consequences are catastrophic. The Cuban Missile Crisis becomes a turning point. The world saw how close it came to nuclear war. America cemented the image of a superpower ready to dictate terms. The Soviet Union saved face, but lost part of its authority. And Nikita Khrushchev acquired the reputation of a gambler capable of bringing the world to the brink of ruin and backing down at the last moment. Internal storms. The beginning of the 60s was a time of cracks inside the system. On the outside, the country was proud of conquering space and new factories. Inside, irritation and fatigue were accumulating. Khrushchev's policy raised more and more doubts among the elite. Factions formed in the Politburo. Some supported reforms, others saw chaos in them. Sovnarkhozes, created to bring management closer to the people, scattered power. Hundreds of local bodies worked without coordination. Enterprises complained about supply interruptions. Instead of accelerating the planned economy, paralysis emerged. Regional committee secretaries wrote complaints but were afraid to speak out openly. The army also cooled. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the military accused Khrushchev of improvisation. Generals believed he dragged the country into a risky game and shamefully retreated. Marshals quietly talked about the irresponsibility of the first secretary. Army support was melting. The intelligentsia, inspired by the thaw, quickly ran into its limits. Khrushchev had permitted the publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich back in 1956. But already in the early 60s, he lashes out at artists and poets. At a meeting with creative intelligentsia, he destroys the avant-garde. He calls paintings daubs, artists, parasites. The transcript of this scene spreads among the intelligentsia as a symbol of the hypocrisy of the thaw. Agriculture experiences a new wave of difficulties. After record first harvests, the virgin lands are exhausted. Dust storms cover Kazakhstan. Millions of hectares turn into desert. In the Central Committee, they increasingly say that the Great Campaign has turned into a failure. But Khrushchev does not back down. He demands new plantings, new reports, new plans. Foreign policy also brings blows. Relations with China collapse completely. Mao Zedong accuses Khrushchev of betraying the revolution. Chinese newspapers publish harsh articles. Alarming reports of armed provocations begin to arrive from the border. A split grows in the world communist movement. By the mid-60s, Nikita Sergeyevich finds himself in isolation. The party is unhappy with his voluntarism. The army does not trust him after the Cuban crisis. The intelligentsia is disappointed. Reforms are stalling. The international situation is complicated. And although outwardly he retains confidence, a decision is already maturing in the corridors. A decision on removal, without blood, without a tribunal, but with the silent consent of almost all his former comrades. The removal. Autumn 1964. Outwardly, everything looks calm. Khrushchev holds meetings, gives speeches, inspects construction sites. But inside the Kremlin, a conspiracy is underway. Leonid Brezhnev, who became Central Committee Secretary, gradually turns into the link for the discontented. He is supported by Alexei Kosygin and Nikolai Podgorny. Mikhail Suslov and other apparatus heavyweights prepare in the shadows. They know Khrushchev's time is coming to an end. Reasons accumulated for years. The economy is stalling. The corn campaign causes laughter. Sovnar causes paralyzed industry. The Cuban crisis undermined the army's trust. The break with China deprived the USSR of an important ally. And the first secretary's outbursts of anger tired even his supporters. The summer of 1964 becomes decisive. At the July plenum, they discuss agriculture. Reports go one after another. The picture is depressing. Drought, grain shortage, purchasing bread abroad. In the corridors, words sound. We cannot tolerate this any longer. September brings a new reason. During a trip to Bulgaria, Khrushchev again causes an emotional scandal. Telegrams about his harsh statements reach Moscow. Opponents are convinced he has lost control. The conspiracy forms completely. Suslov prepares the ideological base. Podgorny organizes support in the Central Committee. Kosygin guarantees the government. Brezhnev is to become the face of the operation. Marshals and the army do not interfere. For them, the promise of stability is enough. October 12, 1964. Khrushchev is summoned from vacation on the Black Sea. He is told there is an urgent meeting in Moscow. A plane delivers him to the capital. Instead of the usual confidence, silence, and wary glances. On October 13th, the Presidium of the Central Committee gathers. Reports sound one after another. The tone is restrained but cold. Kosygin criticizes the economy. Podgorny accuses him of voluntarism. Suslov talks about the destruction of party leadership. Brezhnev is silent until the end, and then utters a soft but deadly phrase. It is necessary to relieve Nikita Sergeyevich of his duties. Khrushchev tries to object, says that he admits mistakes, but much was achieved. Reminds them of the Virgin Lands, the Corn Revolution, the peaceful outcome of the Cuban crisis. But the faces around him are stone. No one argues, no one supports. Everyone is silent. And this silence is scarier than any screams. On October 14th, the Central Committee Plenum officially removes Khrushchev from the posts of First Secretary and Chairman of the Council of Ministers. The wording is soft. Due to health and in connection with advanced age. No accusations of treason or abuse. No arrests, no trial. Just a door closed. In the Kremlin, power is distributed instantly. Brezhnev becomes First Secretary. Kosygin, Chairman of the Council of Ministers. Suslov controls ideology. Podgorny oversees the Presidium. The system stabilizes. Everyone is happy with the silence. And Nikita Sergeyevich leaves for a dacha in Petrovo-Dalneye. Without guards, without positions, without power. His era ended in one day. Without a shot, without a rally, without resistance. History knows few such falls. Yesterday he was the master of a superpower. Today, an old man at a dacha, deprived of the right to even appear in print. His name begins to be whispered. His surname is struck from newspapers. But he is still alive. And ahead of him are years of silence. Years when he will witness his reforms being forgotten and his power turning into a myth. The Old Man in Petrovo-Dalneye. October 1964. Yesterday, he still led the country. Today, he is being driven to a dacha in Petrovo-Dalneye. The doors of the Kremlin have closed forever. The house is simple. A garden, a few rooms, outbuildings. No rallies, no guards with medals. Only a few staff members, family, and silence. Power disappeared in an instant. At first, he cannot get used to it. The habit of getting up at 6 in the morning and demanding reports remains. But reports do not come. The phone is silent. Newspapers write about Brezhnev. The name Khrushchev disappears from the front pages. Neighbors see him in the garden. He works with a shovel, plants vegetables, picks apples. Simple labor becomes a consolation. He who decided the fates of the world now digs garden beds. In the mid-60s, he begins to write memoirs. He makes the first notes on graph paper, writes by hand, then dictates to his wife and children. There is anger and irony in the texts. He talks about Stalin, about the war, about his reforms. He justifies himself and argues with himself. The KGB watches him. Every notebook is copied and goes to a special archive. They allow him to write, but not to publish. Officially, Khrushchev seems to have vanished. No speeches, no articles, no photos. Only the dacha, the family, and the vegetable garden. Sometimes Western journalists visit him. He gives interviews rarely and carefully. Too many ears are listening to every word. But rumors of his memoirs leak to the West. In the early 70s, parts of his memoirs will end up in the USA and be published. For the Soviet government, this will be a disgrace. With the years, his health fails. His heart hurts. Less strength. He sits in an armchair by the window more and more often. Reads newspapers, listens to the radio. Sometimes he smiles when he hears familiar names. Sometimes he shakes his head when he sees new leaders repeating old mistakes. On September 11th, 1971, Nikita Sergeyevich dies at his dacha in Petrovo-Dalneye. The death is quiet, without honors, without fanfares. Even the funeral is modest. The coffin is carried out under KGB supervision. They try not to mention Khrushchev's name aloud. He becomes the only Soviet leader who leaves without arrest, without trial, but also without glory. His grave at the WWII cemetery is modest, black and white stone, like a symbol of the contradictions of his life. The old man in Petrovo-Dalneye remained in memory as a man whom the whole world once feared. But then his own country forgot. The Legacy of Khrushchev. He did not die in a palace. He did not fall in a coup. He faded away. On September 11, 1971, Nikita Khrushchev died quietly, far from the Kremlin corridors where he once ruled. No crowds, no speeches, no monuments. Just a former leader, forgotten by the system he helped build. His legacy is not simple. He exposed Stalin's crimes. He opened the Iron Curtain just a crack. He sent the first satellite into space. He watched Yuri Gagarin orbit the Earth. But he also signed execution lists. He helped build the machinery of terror. He crushed Hungary. He placed nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida. And for 13 days, the world stood on the edge of annihilation. To Americans, he became a symbol of the Cold War. The man who said, "We will bury you." The leader who argued with Nixon in a model kitchen. The gambler who nearly triggered nuclear war. To Russians, he remains a contradiction, a reformer, and an executioner. History will never fully resolve Nikita Khrushchev. He was neither monster nor savior. He was something more dangerous, a believer in ideology, a product of terror, a man who discovered too late that power does not forgive. He did not leave behind statues. He left behind lessons. That absolute power corrupts absolutely, that political systems can devour their own architects, and that one human being, armed with certainty, can bring civilization within inches of extinction. This is not just the story of Khrushchev. It is a warning. About leadership, about fear, about how fragile our world truly is.